Radha is a writer, critic, and translator. She's co-edited The Essential Tagore and translated the works of Rabindranath Tagore and other Bengali writers from India and Bangladesh. Her latest translations include R. Santi Niketan by Mahashweta Devi and 4 chapters by Tagore. Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for translating Tagore.
Good morning, everyone. It's indeed a great pleasure to see such a fulsome audience for Tagore, somebody who's always stayed in our literary history and memory. I have 2 absolutely wonderful scholars and speakers with me. Delighted to welcome you, Radha and Rosinka. So when we're talking about translating Tagore, it's generally believed that it's very difficult to translate his Bengali into English. This is said by people in Bengal, elsewhere, and especially what has been pointed out, that when Tagore himself picked up his work to translate into English, the translation was not as lyrical as the Bengali, and quite often he felt compelled to transcreate, and something came out that was quite different from the original. The famous example, as many of you would know, is Gitanjali. So when Gitanjali won the Nobel Prize, many people pointed out the difference between the Bengali Gitanjali and the English Gitanjali, but the fact remained that it was the English Gitanjali that won the prize. So from that time onwards, translating Tagore has always been a difficult exercise. So I'm going to put the first question to Radha Chakravarty, who has just brought out Char Adhyay, 4 chapters in English. This is a novel which has been translated before. It's also been made into a Hindi film. So what was your motivation, incentive for translating Char Adhyay all over again?
Actually, every time I read Tagore, I feel that he needs to be retranslated again and again and again for different times, different places, and for changing readerships and audiences. Because translation is not a lonely activity which happens between the translator and the source text, as it were. The translation is intended to be read by changing sets of people in changing contexts. And what also happens is that language evolves. The source text may remain the same, but the target language evolves over time. The way we use English changes, the way we receive text changes, the media through which we receive text changes, the reasons for which we read, these reasons change. So I feel that translation in general is something that is a process which is not focused on final, ultimate products. But Tagore in particular is a writer who never ages. He seems to be for every age, but he seems to mean different things to different people at different times. And I think the translator's sensibility has to tune into that when retranslating an already translated text. This is what I felt about Char Adhyay. I was struck by how contemporary this text is. This was published in the 1930s, but it speaks to us in a way that is so vibrantly connected with so many things we face today. Different versions of nationalism, questions of women's place in society, modern subjectivity. All of these things, I think, speak to us in new ways, and I felt compelled to take up this text.
That leads me to a question that I'd like to ask Rosinka. This thing about a modern sensibility coming into the translation and yet retaining the cultural context that Tagore wrote in. So you've done a lot of translation of Tagore, but I'm particularly thinking here about this Chinno Patraboli, the fragmented letters, and also Bhanushingher Padaboli. So the letters, of course, he wrote as a rather young man, and you've come out with a beautiful collection of them. The songs, the Bhanushingher Padaboli was not even written in Bangla. It was written in some kind of an imaginary language which some people thought was Maithili. So when you're dealing with primary texts of Tagore in such formats, What is your thought on making it contemporary, and what is your particular sensibility that goes into it?
So I've translated the Chinno Patrabuli, not Bhanushingir Padabuli actually. Not that I remember, but I have done the letters, and the letters are Rabindranath writing as a very young man. Prose, I think you would agree, Radha, presents a different problem for translators than poetry. It is the poetry actually, which was your first question to start with, which is actually the more difficult to translate. I've written about this. This is, I think, at least, primarily because Tagore uses a lot of compression. He uses a lot of alliteration and sounding words. The sound of his poetry in the Bengali is something that is very difficult to bring onto the page in English. So I have a chapter on, sort of Rabindranath as a young man in my book, The Literary Thing, in which I found the most useful way to think about what is it about the sound of Rabindranath's poetry that doesn't come into the English page. And the only thing that really helped me theorize that was Barth's notion of the rustle of language, because it really is something that you hear in the Bengali that also creates affect, of course, that then is near impossible to put onto the page in English itself. And I'm talking only about the poetry here. Bhanushingir Padabuli is a different thing altogether, because as you know, it's in an invented medieval language, but it does give you some sense of the same problems, because he's over there as well, he's making up this old language, but his own Bengali poetry was also written in a language that was quite new and very innovative in Bengali writing. He followed Bankim Chandra and others, as you know, and he did something completely different with the language. So these are some of the reasons for some of the difficulty with the poetry, at least. So Radha dealt with the prose. I thought I'd
I really like the phrase that you picked up from Barth, the rustle of language. And it makes one aware that language is not something that is static. And that even when an author is writing over the long period of time that Rabindranath did, the quality of his language, the texture of his words, sentences, paragraphs changes. And because he wrote across genres, I completely agree with you that there are different kinds of challenges that a translator faces when the text is fiction, or when the text is poetry, or in the translation that you've done of letters. Even that creates another particular kind of a challenge. Radha, to go back to your new book, which will be released at the end of the session today, the introduction is very beautifully expressive of what is the philosophical thinking on aesthetics between the West and the East. You have a mention there that when Tagore is writing, he's talking of emotions. And you use the word hridoy, heart, as compared to the philosophy of reason that comes out from Western ways of looking at aesthetics. Would you like to elaborate that a little more in the context of your translation?
Yes, I think this goes to the heart of the book, because the dialectic in the book is between reason and what I have referred to as hridoy, or the heart, a phrase, an expression I've actually encountered in the work of Deepesh Chakravarty, writing about Tagore and writing about translations. The central dialectic in this text is actually between this woman, the central character Ella, who has a tussle between her sense of duty and she comes under the charismatic spell of the political activist Indranath, who is a militant nationalist during the independence struggle. And at the same time, she falls in love with a young man who has also joined the struggle, inspired by her. But eventually when she and Atin, the young man, become disenchanted with the machinations of the leader Indranath, she faces this tussle between the cold-blooded reason that Indranath, the scientific man, embodies, and the desires of the heart, which women are always conditioned to repress. And that becomes the central drama, and the woman's psyche becomes the stage where these conflicts are played out. And this is where we see eventually how, for the lovers, the heart wins in the end, and there is this kind of offsetting of the Western ideal of reason and the idea of affect, emotion, desire, and the articulation of that, and an aesthetics that prioritizes this. And this is what I think comes through also, Rosinka, in the poetry, even more than in the prose. And incidentally, talking of Bhanu Singher Padaboli, I have recently published a couple of songs in translation. It's part of a larger collection, so maybe not widely circulated yet, but I did encounter precisely the kind of difficulties you were mentioning, and there was also the joy of recreating these songs, because I realized that translation becomes transcreation, and I think that's the only way you can engage with translating Tagore meaningfully.
That is something that makes us consider the larger context of Tagore. And Rosinka, this very important book that you've written, The Literary Thing, History, Poetry, and the Making of a Modern Cultural Sphere. Now that's a very large and comprehensive project. And do you still think that Tagore retains a central position for you in that map? And if so, in what way?
There's no question of thinking about a modern cultural sphere in Bengal without sort of, not just some reference to Tagore, but with Tagore having a central space in it. My book, however, ends with a very young Rabindranath at the age of 17 when he writes Nichhore Shapnabhango, because the period I'm looking at is actually the 19th century. So I couldn't, because Tagore's works, of course, go into the 20th, and also he didn't I wanted to focus on the period preceding him, because Bengalis are, and sort of people who are generally interested in Indian literature, know much more about Rabindranath, about all of that. So the original intention actually had been to look at the forgotten poets who paved the way for him. No poet is born, in a void or a vacuum. So I wanted to bring that particular literary sphere into focus through episodes of, that animated the 19th century. But I found, in fact, that I couldn't, in the end, avoid bringing him in. So I had to, which is why I brought him in the last chapter, and dealt with him sort of finding his lyric voice through the Padaboli, through Bihari Lal Chakravarty's verse, through developing his own sense of what he wanted to do with the poetic form, which is what the book ends with, because then there's a different story to tell. I mean, the later story is a different story and can be told someday, but there is no question that Tagore is central to it, absolutely.
So both of you have featured in the book Essential Tagore, which was edited by Radha Chakravarty and Fakhrul Alam and was nominated the Best Book of the Year 2011 by Matha Newspaper. So you've discovered yourself as translators of Tagore at a very early stage of your academic and professional careers. This is a very short session, and I don't want to deprive the audience of having an occasion to ask you questions. So a few minutes are available. Very brief questions, please, so that we can cover a little ground in the next 3 or 4 minutes. Yes, please. Please go ahead. And if don't wait for the mic, just shout.
Good morning. My question is, were there certain words or phrases that you encountered that had cultural connotations or nuances to it, so that you couldn't or you did not translate them to another language?
Yes, this always happens. And it's always a struggle, and it's always a challenge. But you have to find a way, depending on the particular words that you're translating in the particular passage that you're translating, the kind of text that you're translating. So there is no formula and no dictionary and no grammar of translation is going to give you a solution to that. Very often I keep the cultural term. Very often I allow the words around it to express what it might be about. Sometimes I don't. For some publications, I use a glossary. Mostly, I dislike using one, and I avoid it. Unless it's the house rule for the publishers, I avoid it. And I feel that a text can have some secrets from the reader, which draws the reader actively into the act of making meaning of the text. We all did that when we were kids, and we read books from other countries, and we couldn't figure out what food they were eating, what games they were playing. And that didn't stop us from enjoying those books. We stepped in and invented and imagined what we didn't know. So I sometimes do that with my translations, and it hasn't stopped, my translations from working with my readers, at least from what I hear.
Give you a concrete example, which might be fun to hear. So in the letters, which are written when he's very young, between the age of 26 and 32, there's a particular letter which, so very trivial, which is to do with a Bihari maidservant who used to work in his home in Calcutta, arriving suddenly out of the blue and approaching him at his houseboat all the way in Shilaidaho in East Bengal, and some tale of grief and woe and how he suddenly has to deal with all of this. The woman's name is Bhajia, or Bhojia as he writes. And the phrase he uses in Bengali is, and the last line of the letter is, the phrase he uses is, Bina Meghe Bhojia Ghat. Now the phrase in Bengali is Bina Meghe Vajrapat, which means suddenly out of the clouds there is thunder. So the best thing to do, as Radha said, was to just keep that in a note, saying this is the Bengali phrase, and you should just enjoy it for what it's sounding like, even if you don't know the language.
Yes, one quick question, and I'll ask both of them to answer it. So let's Is there a mic?
Based on seasons, different seasons. Then Nasaban on Pujo at different seasons. Then again, Bhanushike Potaboli is also there. But what sets it apart from the rest of the songs, the genres, like seasons and then and Bhanushike Potaboli? These are two separate. So what sets apart Bhanushike Potaboli from the rest of the songs?
One very quick answer would be, of course, the language itself. Bhanushingar Podaboli is written in something resembling Maithili. So you can pronounce it in Bengali, but the Gahana Kusuma Kunjo Maje. But it also Gahana Kusuma Kunja Maje. It also so the language itself is a medieval made-up language. It's not actually written in Bengali at all. That's one sort of immediate response to the rest of his corpus, which is of course in modern Bengali. And if Radha,
Another quick answer is that the songs are arranged in thematic categories, and Bhanushingar Podaboli is not primarily about the seasons. The seasons play a very important role there, but it's they play a very important role in evoking the eroticity of the entire song sequence, and they're interwoven. But it's really a thematic arrangement of where the songs of the seasons form one porjay or one section of Tagore's entire collection of songs.
Well, we'll go ahead with the book launch now. Congratulations, Radha, for this new book. But there is a little film that will release the book. Well, thank you very much, Radha and Rosinka, for that wonderful session and for revealing your secrets. I'm sure there are many people in the audience who are translators and aspiring to pick up some new work, and you've given them some happy clues. So thank you to the audience for being so attentive and interested in the subject.